Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, Dark Succubus. The man who rules the world is tempted by a sultry succubus in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Dark Succubus in paperback or pre-order on Kindle Unlimited today. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. Isis, All That Glitters. The goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber in this action-packed all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. A couple of months ago, I did a live stream where I asked the question, is the comic book industry its own worst enemy? And I got an answer to that question in a Newsrama article I read last night, where it talked about DC Comics co-publisher Dan Didio expressing frustration over the publisher's facsimile editions of classic comics outselling current comics that are produced today. Now, during this panel of Meet the DC Publishers at the San Diego Comic-Con, Dan Didio expressed frustration that these facsimile editions, which are reprints of old classic comics all the way down to the original ads, were outselling many of the current comics like Batman. And your Dan Didio is frustrated that these older books are outselling new books, and he doesn't really understand why these older books are outselling the new books. Now, the main reason why a lot of these older books are outselling the new books is primarily because many of these older books feature classic looks for many of the characters, and many of these classic books feature many of the classic stories everybody knows, and most of these stories feature the classic continuity everybody knows from 30 to 40 years ago, and it's these iconic stories that are the thing that brought people into comics, and it was that story model from that era that everybody remembers fondly. So you have people buying these comics, many because they remember buying these comics before when they were younger, buying them again, and we have a lot of new readers picking these up because these stories feature a lot of first appearances of characters, and many feature many of the classic stories that they were told were so great but couldn't go out here and buy because many of these older comics are quite expensive. So many people are being able to buy these older classic comics, and they're being able to buy these older classic comics and access DC characters. However, your Dan Didio is angry that these comics are selling, and that just shows how dysfunctional your Dan Didio is, because when it comes down to publishing, you want to be able to make money. And with the comic book industry in dire straits right now, and many comics barely selling under 40,000 copies, every comic that sells brings revenue to a business that is struggling. So these facsimile comics are a thing that is helping the overall struggling comic book industry, but your Dan Didio is frustrated about them because those old issues make a powerful statement on how incompetent he is as an editor, and how over the last 15 years he has destroyed the DC Comics brand. Now, these facsimile editions show how much of a failure today's contemporary stories are, and how much of a failure the story model has become ever since your Dan Didio took over DC Comics back in 2002. Now, this current story model that we've had right now at DC and many other companies like Marvel, Image, IDW, and Dynamite, and many others, is very dreary, very depressing, and it does not give comic readers an incentive to keep buying comics. Compound this with all of the reboots that people have had to deal with ever since 1997, and most people just are frustrated overall because just as they're starting to get into a series, all of a sudden that series is canceled, and then they have to start over with a new #1 issue. So most people are frustrated about the current story model, and they're frustrated about the reboots, and it shows again a complete failure of leadership at companies like DC Comics, where your Dan Dido is, and his frustration at the Facsimiles is that it shows that if you create great comics, people will go out and buy great comics. So it makes a powerful statement saying that the entire industry's big problem are the people in charge of it, and these people are their own worst enemy because they would rather push their narratives in comics. Like on the Marvel side, you have the Marvel editors who want to push their far leftist SJW content, and then over at DC, you have Dan Dido still, for 15 years, still trying to ram down his vision for DC Comics down people's throats, and people still aren't interested in those comics. So what these Facsimiles do is they show that it is possible for us to have a healthy comic book industry if we had the right people in charge of the comic book industry. So what these Facsimile comics are doing is showing us that there is a real market for comics, and all it takes is for a publisher to have the vision to reach out to those customers. So that's what I'm seeing from these Facsimile comics outselling the regular comics, because when you take a look at the Facsimile editions of old Batman issues, you get a Batman who is strong, confident, and masculine, which is in contrast to what Tom King has been producing in his Batman comics, where we've seen this Bruce Wayne who has become an emasculated beta male who has been literally marginalized in his own comic and minimized to the point where his own father from an alternate universe is doing his job. They have literally turned one of the most popular characters into the DC universe into a complete punk, and you're wondering why Batman sales tumbled after issue 50. And this is why a Facsimile edition featuring the Batman everybody grew up with in the iconic blue and gray costume, the character who had the confidence, the masculinity, and the masculine presence, is outselling the current Batman, who was written by Tom King, a complete wimp, and they're wondering why those books aren't selling. Well, those books aren't selling because, again, Dan Dido has been a failure at DC Comics, and these Facsimiles prove the point that he is a failure as a publisher. His vision is a complete failure, and this is what's got him so frustrated, because now there is irrefutable facts that he is the problem at DC Comics, him and the Warner Brothers executives who think like him, and this is a confirmation from the audience saying what they want. So DC readers have proved the point that the comic book industry still is viable, the marketplace is viable, the structures of the marketplace are viable, but it is the publishers who go out of their way to produce poor quality content. That is the thing that is harming the industry, and that is the thing that is hurting the demand for the industry. And your Dan Dido's frustration shows that he really doesn't understand what comic readers want, what comic fans want, and he's still trying to shoehorn his ideas into an industry where we clearly see no one wants these kind of comics. People want a comic book that will allow them to escape. They want action-packed adventures that allow them to get away from their problems for 32 pages, and they want to be able to read a comic that allows them to have a little fun. And when you read many of today's comics, there's not much fun between the pages of them. Either we're stuck in dreary, depressing, meandering storylines that go on for years at DC Comics, where Dan Dido runs the show, or we're being preached at with identity politics over at CB Cebulski and Sana Amanat's Marvel Comics, and many other comic publishers like Dynamite and Boom and IDW, and people don't want to pay $5 or more for a comic book that brings them more problems and more troubles in their lives. The whole point of a comic book is to be able to sit down and get away from your problems for 10 to 15 or even 30 minutes and get something out of it, like an action-packed adventure, and maybe a few laughs, or have a little fun and get away from your problems for a little while. That's what a great comic does, is it takes us away from our world and brings us to the world of the heroes. But what incentive do people have to go to the world of the heroes if their world is chock full of misery and depression? And again, this is where Dan Dido doesn't connect the dots and understand why people were buying those stories from 30 to 40 years ago, because the reason why people bought those stories from 30 to 40 years ago was because they were able to get that escape, they were able to get that laugh, they were being able to have that good time in between the pages of that comic, and that's something you just can't do in a comic book of 2019, because when you pick up a comic from 2019, it is so miserable and so dreary that you just say to yourself, why would I want to spend money to be miserable, and when I can spend my money on other entertainment options which provide me with a higher entertainment value per dollar? Because with comics costing anywhere from $5 to many even more to $10, what people are saying is, I can go get a Netflix subscription for about the same price and watch dozens of other shows that I enjoy, and I don't have to spend money on a comic book that just isn't fun. So people have better entertainment options, and they're willing to go spend their money on those entertainment options. But when I look at your Dan Dido, I see a man who is one of comic book industry's worst enemies, and he doesn't even understand how he's hurting the overall comic book industry. Because if these facsimile comics are selling, you would think that as a publisher you wouldn't get mad about that, because what that's doing is it's bringing revenue into your publishing house. And that's something that's good for the business of the comics overall, because comics are struggling. And you think with these books selling well, you would start thinking to focus on making today's modern stories more like the stories from 30 to 40 years ago, so that you can get those readers to start picking up the modern comics and enjoying them the same way they enjoyed the old comics. You think you would do that, but no, your Dan Dido is frustrated and angry because no one wants to buy his story model for comics, the same way people don't want to buy Sana Amanat and CB Cebulski's vision for comics, and they're all angry that nobody wants to buy their comics. But the problem is they don't understand that comic book publishing is a business, and in business you do what the customer wants to be done. And when something is being sold and is getting customers to buy it, you make more of what the customer wants. And that's what any businessman like myself, like I'm running the SJS Direct imprint, and if my customers going out here buying books the way they are buying books like The Man Crisis, I'm going to keep making more books like that, because that's what the customers want. But over at DC, you have Dan Dido getting upset because no one wants to buy his DC comics, instead of understanding that in business you do what the customer wants, you make that money, and then you go on and you enrich yourself by making whatever the customer wants. That's business 101. Unfortunately, in the comic book industry, They don't know anything about business. It's all about people's feelings. And I wonder how people will feel if DC Comics implodes, because if you're not thinking about taking care of business, there won't be a comic book industry. And with people like Dan Didio in charge of DC Comics, I don't see this business going on for long, because to get upset about Facsimile Comics outselling your regular comics, any smart publisher is going to say, I'm going to keep printing the Facsimile comics. Moreover, I'm going to take the comics I have right now and make efforts to get them back in line with the old classic comics, and even do things to make them their whole universe like the old classic comics, because to change what sells, what isn't selling, to change what's selling into what doesn't sell, that's completely dysfunctional. And again, it shows how these comic publishers like Dan Didio are their own worst enemy, and how they undermine their own success because they're so caught up in their ego and what they want that they don't think twice about what a customer wants. If you want to try some of my SJS Direct comic style stories, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, or the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. There you will find all my books in Kindle and paperback formats. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam Goddess of. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a demonic dominatrix in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Goddess of in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.